sound while Dr. Stent's speaking.
Yes, that would be fine. Okay, we're going to let it trickle in a little bit because I think Lydia is letting in the attendees, and we will start in just a few seconds. Okay. All right, well, we're going to go ahead and get started today. First of all, I want to say good evening and welcome to everybody who is joining us tonight for this World Affairs Council Virtual Speaker Series. My name is Xiaoyan Zhao. I am the Executive Director of the World Affairs Council of Kentucky and Southern Indiana. We are a hub for international exchange, dialogue, and learning located in Louisville, Kentucky. And as a member of 3 national networks, Global Ties US, World Affairs Councils of America, and our newest one, Sister Cities International, our organization facilitates a variety of international, professional, and youth exchanges, speaker programs, and educational opportunities for the Kentuckiana region all year round. Our organization, World Affairs Council, is a member-supported organization, but not member exclusive in the programs, which are open to the public. Our goal is to ensure that the community has access to expert analysis and quality discussions on topics that really impact us locally, nationally, and globally, especially during this pandemic. So today we are in for a very timely conversation with Dr. Angela Stent, author of Putin's World, Russia Against the West and with the Rest. This talk will be moderated by Dr. Charles Ziegler, professor and university scholar at the University of Louisville. Dr. Ziegler is the director of the Grawemeyer Award for Ideas Improving World Order at U of L, and he specializes in Russia and Eurasia in the political science department. Now, before I turn over to Dr. Ziegler to introduce Dr. Stent and start our program, I just want to give everybody a quick reminder about our functionalities and what our run of show will be. This webinar is recorded, and we are going to be live streaming it on Facebook. WAC members will have access to the recording of the program afterwards. We will have about 30 minutes of moderated conversation, followed by a moderated Q&A for another about 30 minutes, which may include some of the questions that were submitted earlier. I just want to make sure that everybody understands you can submit a question at any time during this program, and they will be answered as many as time allows. So if we're not going to be able to have you ask questions, unfortunately, verbally. So just make sure to submit your questions through the Q&A. And now, without further ado, I am going to go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Ziegler to start us off. Welcome. Oh. Dr. Ziegler, are you there? Oh, do we lose him? Uh-oh. Let's see. I think we might have lost him for 1 second. Just give me 1 quick second.
He looks frozen.
I think he's frozen too. I think he is frozen. Oh, I think he went off, and he's going to come on very soon.
Maybe he'll come back in again.
Yes, he will come in very soon. We're really looking forward to
Joys of Zoom, right?
Yes, you know, technology is great when it works,
Exactly.
but not when it doesn't. We don't have too many ways to get around it. So let's hope he should be getting on very soon. Give him 1 quick second. But while we're waiting, we're really excited to have Dr. Stent joining us this evening. I know that you're teaching at Georgetown. Classes have started. And you are a pro at this whole Zoom thing. So I'm sure we're going to get through this just fine.
I'm a pro at the whole Zoom thing with a little help from my teaching assistant. She's the real pro, so I rely on her.
We definitely need the specialists. We need a specialist. All right. Let's see. Bring him in really quickly. Oh, let's see. Well, why don't I go ahead, as we wait for Dr. Ziegler to come in, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our Dr. Stent tonight. And I want to very quickly just let everybody know our program tonight. So Dr. Stent is the director of the Center for Eurasian, Russian, and East European Studies, and a professor of government and foreign service at Georgetown University. Between 2004 and 2006, she served as National Intelligence Officer for Russia and Eurasia at the National Intelligence Council. She is the author of The Limits of Partnership, U.S.-Russian Relations in the 21st Century, for which she won the American Academy of Diplomacy's Douglas Dillon Prize for the best book on the practice of American diplomacy. So we are delighted to have Dr. Stent, and we are very happy that Dr. Ziegler has been joining us. So I took part of your work and introduced our speaker, so I'm going to let you go ahead and take it over.
Okay, I'm sorry about that. We had apparently a power transformer blew in our neighborhood, and the power went out briefly. Have you done the introduction, Zhang-Yin? My apologies. Dr. Stent, did she introduce you?
She did. So
right,
unless you have any other preliminary remarks, I think maybe we should just tell the audience. So I'm going to make a few introductory remarks about my book, and then Professor Ziegler will be in a dialogue with me about the book. That's how it's going.
All right. Yeah, that sounds good. I thought if you could just tell us your reason for writing this book. It's broad. It's really comprehensive. As I told you, I think I'd use it for my Russia and Eurasia course. But why don't you go over it and tell us some of the key things you think Americans really should know about Russia and that they can get from your book.
Right. Thank you. So when I set out to write the book, I was really asking three questions. The first one was, why was the West so wrong in the early 1990s? We thought when the Soviet Union collapsed, that post-Soviet Russia would want to become more like the West, would want to be integrated with the West, would move towards a system that looked more like a Western democracy with market economy. And we also at that point thought that trade, that economic relations with Russia, if we increased them, would somehow have a beneficial effect on political relations too. So the idea was to integrate Russia economically with the rest of the world, and hopefully that would have political spillover. So the second question I ask is, how is Putin's Russia, and he's of course been in power for 20 years, how has Putin's Russia, with a GDP the size more or less of that of Italy, with declining population, with crumbling infrastructure, and overly dependent on revenues from hydrocarbons for its budget, about 50% of the budget coming from that, how was it able to restore its place as a great power on the world, to return to areas of the world from which it had retreated after the Soviet collapse? And the title of my book, as was already mentioned, is Putin's World, Russia with the West and against, Russia against the West and with the rest. And so why does much of the rest of the world view Russia as a large authoritarian country with whom they can do business, whereas Russia's relations with the West are so antagonistic? And I think in the West, in the US, tend to forget that Russia has quite productive relations with a number of other countries around the world. So that was the second question. How was Putin able to do it? And then the third and most difficult question was, how could the West develop a somewhat more productive relationship with Russia? Is there a better way to do this? Or are we doomed to repeat these cycles of sort of trying to reset relations and then getting disappointed? So I'll just say a few words about the answers to those questions, and then I'll come on to the question about that Professor Ziegler raised about what do I want you to know about Putin's Russia. So I think in answer to the first question, why did we get it wrong in the early 1990s? I think we often thought that the difficulty of dealing with the Soviet Union during the Cold War was because they were at least nominally communists. And of course, it turns out that really the difficulty with dealing with the Soviet Union was largely because they were Russians. And by that I mean that Russians have a very specific view of their place in the world and of the nature of the state. And this is a view that was there during the Tsarist period, it was there during the Soviet period, and it's there also now in the post-communist period. And Putin himself has talked about Russia's unique civilization, that it's different from that of the West, that it's superior to that of the West. I go back in the book and talk historically about people who were talking in the 19th century even, that Russia's relations with the West were doomed to be antagonistic, that they could never really cooperate. We know that Putin has said that the collapse of the Soviet Union was a great geopolitical catastrophe. And so again, that's something where Putin has been determined to restore a strong state in Russia, to restore Russia as a great power. And for him, that has meant that Russia has a right to a sphere of influence in its immediate neighborhood, in those post-Soviet states. And so part of this uniquely Russian view is also Russians' view of their place on the Eurasian continent. Russia doesn't have any natural borders except in the north. And if you go back now to the 18th century, Catherine the Great, the Prussian princess who became the empress of the Russians, said, "That which stops growing begins to rot. I have to expand my borders in order to keep my country safe." So the Russian idea was that only by expanding borders, only by absorbing neighboring territories could Russia really be safe from invasion. And so today's Russia really regards the borders of the former Soviet space as Russia's defense perimeter, not the borders of the Russian Federation itself. And this idea of defensive expansionism is something that's very deeply rooted, if you like, in the Russian historical consciousness. Russian really doesn't give up territory permanently. Russia has lost territory periodically over the centuries, but it's always tried to regain it. And so I think this is, you see that at play if you look at the relationship now with Belarus, which I'm sure we'll talk about a little bit more, or with Ukraine, or with some of Russia's other neighbors. Now, on the question of how Russia was able to play a weak hand so well, Putin is not a master strategist, but he is a very good tactician. And he has been able to take advantage of opportunities presented to him by divisions in the West, by the West's distraction. He had a plan when he came to power. He did want to restore Russia as a great power. I would say the West didn't really have a similar plan in the 3 decades since the collapse of the Soviet Union. And so he's been very good at doing that. And he has he had a good training for that. Of course, he was a KGB case officer in his youth. And so he understood in a way how to sort of take the psychological measure of people and try and exploit their weaknesses. But, and this is something else I point out in the book, Putin is also a judo champion. He had a rough childhood. He used martial arts and judo really to get out of that. And he became a judo champion in 1976 in Leningrad, where he was living. And the local newspaper at the time, and I have this in my book, said that you want to watch this young man, he's going places. I think they didn't realize at that point exactly how far he was going. But I think as a judo champion, he understood, again, how you can turn your own, if you're weaker than your opponent, you can still turn that into a strength if you do it with great dexterity. And so I think that was another reason why Russia or Putin has been able to return Russia, and he's done it rather cheaply. And so on the final question of how do we have a more productive relationship with Russia, and maybe again we'll come back to that in the Q&A session that we have, I don't think relations are going to get better anytime soon. There probably are somewhat better ways of interacting with Russia so that one can avoid cycles of great expectations and then disappointments. But that we do have fundamentally different views of the drivers of world politics, and again of this question of spheres of influence, how the world should be run, and that those act as a significant obstacle, at least, to improving relations. So maybe I will stop there, and if you have some other questions, answer them.
Well, you mentioned about the importance of what's sometimes called the near abroad, or the former Soviet republics, and of those, certainly Ukraine and Belarus are the most important. We've seen the huge decline in relations after 2014 when Russia annexed Crimea. Now we see these massive demonstrations in Minsk and elsewhere in Belarus. Putin is suggesting that he might lend Lukashenko some security forces to help maintain order. How do you see this playing out, and what impact might it have on Russia's relations both with Europe and with the United States?
So I would recommend everyone go on the internet and watch just a little bit of President Lukashenko's meeting with President Putin yesterday in Sochi in Russia. The body language is fascinating. Putin is sitting there looking rather bored and staring at his feet. Lukashenko is leaning forward and entreating Putin. Actually, at that point, he was talking about how NATO was menacing Belarus. So Belarus and Russia, of course, have a union state on paper. Belarus is Russia's really only formal ally. But Lukashenko has until now been very wary about really pushing the integration of the two states. Then, of course, we had the election. We've had all the protests. They're continuing, challenging him. The European Union has said that its foreign policy spokesman said it doesn't recognize his election as being legitimate. I think the Russians were quite shrewd. The Kremlin waited a while to see whether he was going to remain in power, to see whether a color revolution would really take place. And what they saw was, despite the demonstrations, the security forces are largely loyal to Lukashenko, not entirely, and that he's managed to retain power. He's obviously used repression, torture, jailing people, but he's still in power. And so what I think the Russians are trying to do now is to use this leverage to tighten the integration of the Union state and really to make Lukashenko more dependent on them. They have now said that the special units they had on the border, which they might have used had they needed to do that militarily, they've now been deactivated, but obviously they're still very present there. So they've offered Mr. Lukashenko a $1.5 billion loan. And they have, in return for that, they really do want to push the further integration of this union state. They want constitutional change and possibly another election going forward. I think it's known that there's little love lost between Lukashenko and Putin, but for the moment, Putin has understood that Lukashenko needs to remain in power for the time being until a suitable successor is chosen, but one that certainly will look to Russia. Until now, Lukashenko had tried to play this game, playing Russia off against the West. We even had Secretary Pompeo in Belarus recently signing an oil deal. We exported some oil to Belarus after a period when they were having a dispute with the Russians over the price and the quantity of oil that was delivered. I think this has really put an end to it. I think Lukashenko now understands that the sort of flirtation with the European Union, looking to maybe have better relations with the US, he has to make a choice now, and clearly the choice is Russia, because Russia is at the moment backing him up. I think the US faces a dilemma here. We haven't had an ambassador in Belarus since 2008, and we recently appointed a very highly qualified diplomat to go out there. She's had her confirmation hearing, but she still hasn't gone out there. And the question now is for the US, should we send an ambassador there to deal with a government whose election one can really certainly question whether Lukashenko really was reelected on August the 9th, or should we boycott it? And I think the arguments in favor of sending an ambassador there are very sound. It's better to have contact with the country than to remain away from it. But I think we would be all very conscious of how limited any Western influence is. So I think for the time being, we'll see greater Belarusian dependence on Russia, and depending on what happens, you really could see the formation of a true unitary state, Russia-Belarus. But I think what's also happening is turning the Belarusian people against Russia in a way that they haven't been before because of the way that the opposition figures have been treated.
Well, if we stay with foreign policy for a bit, there are a couple of real successes, I think, for Putin. One is a relationship with China, which is called a strategic partnership, and which you detail in a chapter, and which looks like really a pretty solid, both sides say better than it's ever been. And then the second area is in the Middle East, and you have that fascinating chapter where you walk us through each of the new relations, whether it's Saudi Arabia, Israel, Iran, Turkey. And when I finished that chapter, I thought, boy, compared with what the US has done in the Middle East recently, we really seem to be coming out on the short end of the stick compared with Putin's successes. Could you say a little bit about each of those foreign policy issues?
Sure. So those are the two foreign policy successes that I see for Putin. In the case of China, as you well know, because I know that you write about these things as well, you know, in 1969, the Soviets and the Chinese were shooting at each other over the border, and a book was written by American journalist Harrison Salisbury, War Between Russia and China Without a Question Mark. And of course, throughout the Cold War, the Sino-Soviet split was, you know, very real. That, of course, began to change once the Soviet Union collapsed. Relations began to improve, but they've really gotten much tighter since 2014, since the events in Ukraine with the annexation of Crimea and the launch of the war in southeastern Ukraine. The Chinese have stepped in. The West tried to boycott Russia. It didn't work. You can't boycott Russia if and isolate Russia if the Chinese are there. And so the Chinese moved in. They signed a massive natural gas deal with Russia. They've been negotiating this for years, and the Russians didn't want to accept the low price that the Chinese wanted to pay, but they didn't have any choice in 2014. So the economic relationship improved. But I think what binds the two countries together is, I think, a common sense of grievance against the West, feeling that the post-Cold War order has not taken into account their legitimate interests. They talk about the need for a post-West order, whatever that is. And they both back each other up as authoritarian leaders. Neither ever criticizes the other for the way that they treat their own people. And so from the Russian perspective, this is a very important aspect of the Sino-Russian partnership, is this, you know, support for Putin's authoritarian rule by the Chinese, knowing that they're not going to criticize it. And so the relationship has developed since 2014 militarily. The Chinese have taken part now in military exercises for a couple of years with Russian and also Central Asian troops. For the Chinese troops, it's been a way, since they haven't been involved in combat, to exercise like that. And they're apparently about to sign a new military agreement, cooperation agreement. We don't know what that is. They do not want a formal alliance. Both sides say that they don't want to be bound by a formal alliance, but it's certainly a strategic partnership. There's extravagant praise, which of course one has to discount. In the book, you can see a picture of President Putin teaching President Xi Jinping how to make blini, Russian pancakes, just at the same time as the military exercises are going on. On the other hand, of course, there are huge asymmetries. China is a rising power. The Chinese talk about a G2, or think about a G2, a world where the US and China dominate, and they don't actually see Russia as being in that league. Russia is not a rising power, but it apparently has accepted for now the role of a junior partner in this relationship. And then there's the shared neighborhood of Central Asia with the very dynamic Chinese Belt and Road project, which of course involves many of the Central Asian countries. Russia really isn't going to get very much out of this. Putin, of course, has the Eurasian Economic Union, which began to operate in 2015. And I think the Belt and Road isn't completely compatible with that, even though they've signed agreements about it. And then, of course, there are territorial questions. The Russian Far East is very depopulated. There are about 6 million people there. On the other side of the border, I think there are by now 120 million Chinese. What happens to the Russian Far East in the long run? Once upon a time, these were Chinese territories, but they haven't been since the middle of the 19th century. So there are questions about the long-term nature of this relationship. But for right now, it's increasing in closeness, I would say. And I think the idea that some people have in the United States that you can somehow entice Russia away from China is just misplaced. Because from Putin's point of view, again, Chinese support for him and his rule is really an existential question. On the Middle East, what's so interesting about Russia's return there is that this time, unlike in the Soviet period when the Soviets really only wanted to deal with countries that had declared that they were pro-socialist or on their way to socialism. Russia is the only great power now in the Middle East that talks to all sides, all groups on every side of every dispute in a way that the US is not, particularly in the last 4 years since Iran has now been declared, a major enemy. And so much of US policy in the Middle East is focused on what to do about Iran and how to counter it. And so the Russians, came back essentially in September 2015 when they started a bombing campaign in Syria because their ally, Bashar al-Assad, looked as if he might be defeated. That was also, I think, a way of showing that you can't isolate Russia. It was back. And so since then, as you mentioned, they've developed much closer ties with two American allies, Saudi Arabia and Israel. With Saudi Arabia, it has a lot to do with oil and wanting to maintain higher oil prices. But you actually had a mini war, oil war between Russia and Saudi Arabia earlier on this year. Because of COVID, the prices were falling, price of oil was falling. Actually, President Trump intervened, mediated in that dispute. But still, the Saudis and the Russians not only have in common, their desire to regulate production of oil, but they've now developed also more of a security relationship. The Saudis are buying Russian arms. They've pledged to invest significant amounts in Russia. And the relationship with Israel is also very interesting because, of course, during much of the Cold War, the Soviet Union and Israel didn't have diplomatic relations. They were restored under Gorbachev. But now, you have a significant portion of the population of Israel comes from the former Soviet Union. You've had the business links, but Israel has become quite dependent also on Russia in terms of its own conflict with Syria, and Russia, to some extent, attenuating and trying to regulate what the Iranians and Hezbollah are doing there. So both the Saudis and the Israelis believe and hope that the Russians can moderate what the Iranians do. I think they maybe exaggerate Russian influence there. But anyway, it is a key player there. And I think even though you've now had yesterday what looks like a fairly significant US diplomatic victory, in as much as you've had recognition of Israel by the UAE and Bahrain and possibly some other Gulf states, Russia is still a player in the Middle East in a way that it hasn't really been ever.
Okay, if we turn to domestic affairs now, we've got a question from the audience about corruption in Russia, that in various regions outside of Moscow, we see corruption pretty extensively among governors, regional authorities there. I know that, well, we had elections, regional elections just this past Sunday. And it seems that there's more and more disenchantment with United Russia, the party that supports Putin. So if you could speak a little bit to sort of both questions, the issue of corruption and how that impacts governance in Russia, and the issue of the regions and how extensive support is for Putin out in the regions and how corruption may play into that.
Yeah, these are all very important questions. So I think all people who live in Russia accept that corruption is a way of life. What I think they've become more outraged about is the extent of high-level corruption. We know that, Mr. Navalny, still in a hospital in Berlin, was poisoned presumably because whoever poisoned him wanted to get rid of him because he's been exposing both high-level corruption at the very top, but also corruption in the regions. He was actually in Siberia when he was poisoned, campaigning and telling people, explaining to people how to do smart voting so that United Russia wouldn't do so well in those elections. Now, if the question is, has the cognizance of corruption soured people on the leadership in Russia? I would say to some extent it has. So on one opinion poll by Levada, which is the most respected polling organization, more than 50% of Russians say they want change. They don't like the status quo. They want change. Putin's popularity has fallen from 80% that it apparently was a couple of years ago to, I think it's now 66%, which is much lower for him, you know, in a Western context, that doesn't look so bad. So his personal popularity has fallen. If you look at these regional elections that took place this weekend, United Russia did pretty well on a higher level. But if you look at some of the municipal councils, Novosibirsk in Siberia, where in fact Navalny had been, or Tomsk, United Russia no longer controls the municipal councils there. So you've seen gains by non-United Russia parties in these councils. And I think the other thing to mention is it's been, I think, nearly 2 months now that you've had demonstrations in Khabarovsk, the Russian Far East, on the border with China. Why are they demonstrating? Because their governor, who is not from the United Russia party, he's from the so-called Liberal Democrats, which is actually a kind of a far-right party. He was arrested on charges of corruption and ordering the murder of someone and was whisked off to Moscow to be tried. And so the people are out in the streets now defending their governor from Moscow, saying that Putin should go, and saying that, you know, if he is to be tried, he has to be tried in Siberia. And this reminds us in Khabarovsk that there's a lot of also regional identity in Russia. It's a vast country, obviously, and there are many different identities, but regional identities are important. And so they also combine with the corruption question, and they've obviously had people out in the streets. So yes, the recognition of high-level and lower-level corruption is there, and I think maybe people's level of toleration for that is decreasing, and I think the COVID pandemic has maybe exacerbated that, as people have seen, particularly in the provinces, how bad some of the health facilities are, the public health system, where money that should have been allocated to that has been siphoned off for something else.
Okay, over the past 4 years, we've heard a lot about Russian interference in American politics. In the 2016 election, and then US intelligence agencies now are saying that we're going to see even more sophisticated interference in the upcoming elections in November. The Russians seem very good at playing on the deep divisions that exist within our society. So I'd ask you, if you would, to sort of evaluate the threat of this Russian interference to American democracy. And one of our audience has asked, do you think that Putin may have some information that would compromise Mr. Trump?
So I'll take the second question, then I'll get to the broader question. You know, the answer to does Putin have something over President Trump is obviously nobody knows. I think one answer might be if we ever see the his tax returns, Trump's tax returns, and we find out more about the financial dealings of his own Trump organization. His own son has said that in 2008, when they really needed loans, the Trump organization, they borrowed money from various Russian financial entities. There are issues about Russian oligarchs who have bought properties from Trump. So there are a range of financial questions that have to do with the relationship between the president himself and his organization with different Russian entities that might shed some light on this relationship. We certainly know that President Trump has never criticized President Putin personally. President Putin, by the way, has never criticized President Trump and has criticized the American people for not allowing President Trump to do his job properly. So we know that, you know, that he hasn't criticized him. Whether there's anything else, nobody knows. But I think if you look at President Trump, he seems to admire strongmen. And some people have pointed out, you know, what Vladimir Putin represents is the president of a country, and he and his close associates control most of the assets of the country too. So people talk about Russia Inc. as a model for how to understand how Russia is ruled. And so the idea that Putin in fact kind of runs the Russian Federation almost like his personal company, that I think is something that probably appeals to President Trump. So the idea that, you know, the president of a country can also sort of run it as his own business. And I think that might be part of the source of the admiration for Putin, because I think there's definitely admiration there. Whether there's anything more sinister, as I say, I think nobody knows. So on the broader question of Russian election interference, I mean, what the Russians were doing in 2016 and what they're doing this year is they understand the polarization in American society, and they have been very adept at using our own social media to amplify this kind of polarization. So in 2016, and you have the same thing today, you have people sitting, whether it's in the Internet Research Agency in St. Petersburg, or whether it's in Ghana, where they employ young people to deal with the social media, having particularly to do with racial polarization. So whoever it is, they are using social media, and they're posting fake news, and they're amplifying. I mean, if you just look at some of the things they're posting about, for instance, Vice President Biden, it amplifies the things that you've heard in other places about mental capacities, about links to Ukraine, things like that. So what they're doing is they are aiding and abetting, if you like, the polarization that exists here. And obviously we need to be much more vigilant, the social media do, about policing that. But I think the threat to democracy essentially comes from our own polarization. And to the extent that the Russians can aid and abet that, you know, they like to see a chaotic America because they can then say, how can you preach to us, the Russians, about how we run our society, about the fact that we're not democratic? Look at you. So I think we have to do two things. We have to look at ourselves and understand how our own polarization has affected this country in the last few years. And then we have to make sure that we minimize how much the Russians can exploit that.
We have a question here in the Q&A from Max asking about Navalny. He says Navalny is awake, and he said he wants to return to Russia. Should he do this? Will this at all help his movement? And if there's another attempt on his life, what will this mean for the resistance?
Yes, so Navalny does have a countrywide movement. He has people in all the major cities in Russia who support him and organize for him, but he is the charismatic leader. You know, he has a very popular YouTube where he shows these videos that expose all of the corruption. And without him, the movement isn't quite the same. I mean, the activists are still there, but they don't have a leader. He is recovering, and he has said that he wants to go back to Russia. I think many people in his situation would probably, you know, agree to live in exile, but, you know, he has a mission, and his mission is, you know, to combat the corruption and, in essence, to try and bring to power a government that is less corrupt. And for that, he can only do that if he goes back to Russia. I think one has to assume that, you know, whoever did this to him this time, that those people are still going to be there. And so he'll have to be very careful, you know, going forward, watching out for what he does. But he is certainly, he and the people who support him are so committed to their cause that I think exile for him isn't an option.
Another question from our audience, how is Putin engaging with the European Union? How do EU leaders view Putin? And in general, I think that the question is getting at relations between the EU and Russia. Could you go ahead and assess those for us?
Sure. I mentioned a little while ago that the EU Foreign Policy Chief, Mr. Borrell, today said, for instance, that the European Union doesn't recognize the election of Lukashenko, and also is now considering more sanctions against Russia. So the relationship between the European Union and Russia has soured over the last years. At one point, the European Union developed this partnership for modernization with Russia, where they were supposed to interact, sort of again on the premise that closer economic ties would spill over into better political ties, and that Russia would want to modernize in the way that the EU conceived it. And that, you know, partnership for modernization really didn't improve very much, and it didn't have very many results. Germany has been the leader in the European Union in dealing with Russia for obvious reasons, particularly with Chancellor Merkel as the leader. I would say she's the world leader who understands Putin better than anyone else. She grew up in East Germany. She knows what it means when Putin was a KGB agent in East Germany from 1985 to 1990. She speaks very good Russian. She literally speaks his language, and she has tried to have this balance between engagement with Russia and economic relations with Russia, energy relations with Russia, but also trying to push back in areas where, where Russian behavior is not acceptable. And Germany really was the key country keeping together the European Union after the annexation of Crimea and imposing sanctions on Russia. And these sanctions are still there. But Germany has really, in the last, I would say, few weeks, taken a much harder stance towards Russia. And this is even before the Navalny poisoning. A couple of years ago, there was a major breach of all of the computers in the Bundestag that emanated from Russia. They hacked into the Bundestag computers. Just last year, a Chechen opponent of Putin was in broad daylight killed in one of the main parks in Berlin. So this has been building up now. And the fact that since Navalny has been in Berlin, you've had the head of the Foreign Intelligence Service in Russia saying that the Germans maybe are the one who poisoned Navalny, that when he came there, he was fine. And you've had this on the main Russian TV stations on Sunday night, the talk show host. I think this has really annoyed and angered Merkel herself and many in her party. And so you've already had more officials now in Germany saying that this Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline, which is nearly completed, that Germany shouldn't go ahead with it. The US has tried to sanction it anyway. So Germany's position has very much changed. And I would say many countries in Europe now, their position toward Russia has hardened. But there are some EU countries, like Hungary particularly, also Slovakia, to some extent Bulgaria, whose attitude towards Russia, and Spain to some extent, and Italy, who have had a more benign view of Russia and have said, we shouldn't have sanctions, we should interact with Russia. The hardliners are really Poland and the Baltic states, and the UK in many ways, obviously, having had the Skripal poisonings there and other poisonings before that. So the EU is not united in its policy toward Russia, but to the extent that it does pursue a coherent policy, it is now taking a harder line. So what the Russians are also doing, of course, they do election interference in other countries. There's some question about what they did during the whole process leading up to the Brexit vote, how involved they were in that. But what they certainly do now is that they support parties of the far right. So the German AfD, the National Front in France, all of the extreme right-wing parties are pro-Russian, and some of them, like the French National Front, has gotten money from Russia. They also support the extreme left in Europe to the extent that it's there. Anyone who is Eurosceptical definitely gets support from the Russians. So the relationship in general with the EU has deteriorated, but there's some pockets, some countries and groups that are still more pro-Russian.
Another question from Benjamin. He wants to know, that intelligence agencies and a high-profile investment fund CEO have speculated that Vladimir Putin's concealed net worth would make him one of the most wealthy people in the world. What does this tell us about Mr. Putin as president?
So,
interesting question.
It's a great question. We don't really know what his net worth is, but we do know that when the Panama Papers were released, and it turned out that his good friend, who's a cellist, had a $2 billion bank account in Panama, that did raise questions there. In general, obviously, one of the difficulties of ascertaining exactly what the net worth is that you're not going to find a bank account in his name. Obviously, all of the assets, wherever they are deposited in such a way as it's very, that the real owner can't be traced. What it tells us is, and I come back to the Russia Inc., that Vladimir Putin and the people around him have amassed huge amounts of money. Again, we don't know what they are, but they've large sums of money. Some of it rents from oil and gas revenues, so that when the price of oil is up and when sales are good, then that's very good from them, but from other sources as well. And that they're all very dependent on Putin himself, but that he's dependent on them. So if you look at the way Russia is ruled, Putin may be the single most powerful person there, but he's not all powerful. He certainly depends on groups of people around him, and they depend on him. And therefore, you know, when the West tries to sanction or has sanctioned individuals that are close to Putin, they're not allowed to visit the West, to visit their assets, their homes, etc., in the belief that these people would get together and say, we need another president, we need better relations with the West so that we don't get sanctions. That's not how the system works. I mean, these people are dependent, the oligarchs around Putin, many of whom come from the intelligence services, are dependent on him to retain their assets, and he's dependent on them. And one of the things this tells us, and this is true of all authoritarian regimes, the succession issue is a big problem. Putin has just now, in July, put to a vote constitutional amendments, the most important of which is that he can now, if he wants to, stay in power until 2036. It reset the clock, the electoral clock for him. And part of this is because the people around him, they don't want him to go because they don't know what's going to happen to him, to them when he goes. And he needs them also to stay in power. And so the ultimate, I think, result of a system where you have a leader and a small number of people around him who've amassed significant amounts of wealth is the succession, is what do you do when he's no longer in power?
Another member of the audience has a specific question that I'd like to elaborate on a little bit and ask you to address. Is it not true that adherents to Marxism in Russia are making a significant comeback? I would like to broaden that out and just get your assessment of developments in Russian society. Do you see it as becoming more nationalistic, more religious, more conservative? We know that conservatives in this country admire Russian society for not being politically correct, not being subject to the whims of the left. But as you and I know, there are a lot of different currents within Russian society. How would you assess this?
So to the Marxism, of course, there's still a communist party in Russia. I would say most of its members are more my demographic than a younger demographic, but there are some younger people who are in the Communist Party. But even the Communist Party isn't what it used to be. It may be nominally Marxist-Leninist, but it's also very nationalistic, and I will come back to that. So, you know, there are some left-wing, younger people who are left-wing in Russia, but that's really not the main current. I would say, particularly among younger people and older people too, nationalism is much more predominant. You have the Orthodox Church now restored to its traditional role that it had under the Tsars as being, you know, the official state church and playing a very important political role. This new constitution had a number of amendments, all of which I think would please conservatives in this country too. God is mentioned in the Constitution. It is explicitly said that marriage is between a man and a woman. And there are also a number of other provisions there that are socially very conservative. So certainly the line that Putin has pushed, internationally, he has said that Russia should be the leader of, you know, a conservative international, traditional family values. He said that Western Christianity is satanic because it's politically correct. So he certainly, that's his message, but it resonates even among people who don't necessarily support him. And there certainly are opposition movements in Russia that are much more nationalistic than Putin, that would like Russia to be more nationalistic. And Navalny, by the way, is pretty nationalistic too. He certainly hasn't rushed to support the Ukrainian cause. And he has made disparaging remarks about Central Asians and others. So I think you have to see him as a nationalist, although he's an anti-corruption crusader as well. As for the younger people, I do a video class with my Georgetown students and students at the Moscow State Institute of International Relations, which unlike Georgetown University is actually under the Foreign Ministry. And certainly those young people, of course, they're self-selected because they study there, they want to join the diplomatic or intelligence services, and that's why they're there. But they certainly have, I would say, a much more conservative view. And also these young people, you know, who were born after the collapse of the Soviet Union, certainly, none of them believe that the Soviet Union collapsed because of its own internal weaknesses. They believe that the Soviet Union collapsed because of the United States, its special services, other outside influences. So if you have generations of young people who believe that the only reason why the Soviet Union collapsed was because the US and its allies somehow engineered that, then you also have a group of young people who believe that if you can't restore the Soviet Union, at least, you have to restore, you know, a great Russia with that influence. And so I think within Russian society, you have obviously a number of different trends. You do have younger people and older people who are democratic activists, who want something different for Russia, who want the post-Putin period to move towards much more of a democracy, but you have much more nationalistic people too. You do have currents of Marxism, Leninism. I think it's, you know, it's very diverse. It's a very diverse country. And obviously in places like the North Caucasus and Tatarstan, you have a revival of Islam, and you have a revival of quite radical Islam there too. So many different kinds.
A question going back to Belarus. One of our audience wants to know, could Putin have played a larger role in influencing the election in Belarus? And if he didn't, why didn't he?
Well, you know, I think that at the point before the election, Lukashenko, I think, was much more self-confident, apparently, than he should have been. And he was still in a phase there where he was operating as someone who was trying to balance Russia against the West. And so I think it was, he probably never anticipated that the opposition forces would be strong enough, and particularly since the woman who ran against him, her husband really was the candidate who should have run, but he was in prison. And so she came into this late, she ran against him. She didn't have a high profile. I'm sure he was pretty dismissive of her, certainly also as a young female candidate. And I think he didn't expect that this would happen. And so if you look at what the Russians did in the beginning, the first week or two, they were actually much more cautious. They never came out and definitely said that, you know, these were the correct figures for the election tallies. And then as time went on, they backed him much more. So I think maybe the Russians didn't do more because Lukashenko was trying to keep them more at bay. That's all changed now.
And I think we're getting close to the time, but I do have what I think is a really pretty important question. In your book, you talk about different resets in U.S.-Russia relations. And this is something that's been of interest to me too over the years, that one would have expected with the collapse of communism, we could have built a stronger relationship, but each of the different resets then founders on some issue or other. If Joe Biden wins the election in November, we have a new administration come in. Do you see chances of another reset similar to the last one under Obama? Or do you continue to see continued hostility really between our two countries?
Yeah, I mean, Vice President Biden was the one who announced at the Munich Security Conference in 2009 that we had a reset. And then, of course, Secretary Clinton met with Foreign Minister Lavrov with a button that was supposed to be say reset in Russian, but it said overload. So that mistranslation was a harbinger of the problems that were going to come. I mean, if you look at what's happened in the past 30 years since the Soviet collapse, the issues in US-Russian relations haven't changed that much. And you've had different administrations trying their own resets, and they've all foundered, I think, largely because the Russian definition of what a productive relationship would look like is quite different from the American definition. I think you have to start from that premise. My sense with the Vice President Biden is that they would not want to try another reset. After all, the reset worked in the first Obama term because Dmitry Medvedev was the president. even if he was really only the de jure and not the de facto president, he was still the president. He was the one who, negotiated with President Obama. So you've got Vladimir Putin in the Kremlin, and it's been very difficult, obviously, to improve relations with Russia. I think what the Biden team would do differently is, one assumes, is have a more coherent policy. Because what you basically have now is you have President Trump, who has his own policy toward Russia, wants to improve ties to Russia, and hasn't been able to do that because Russia is such a toxic subject. And then you have the State Department, the Defense Department, et cetera, which have pursued a pretty consistent tough policy toward Russia. But there's been cacophony. There hasn't been a unity of policy toward Russia. Presumably, under a President Biden, you would have a more unified policy to start off with. Secondly, a Biden administration would certainly pursue traditional arms control with Russia in a way that the Trump administration hasn't wanted to. The New START agreement that regulates strategic nuclear weapons is set to expire on February the 5th next year. It could be extended quite easily. It's possible that the Trump administration might still do that, but they have insisted until now that China be brought into these negotiations, and the Chinese have, in no uncertain terms, said they have no interest in being brought into these negotiations. So I think you'd have a resumption of more traditional arms control negotiations. You might have a restoration of some of the channels of communication that were ended really after the events in Ukraine and have deteriorated further. On the other hand, I think you would probably also get more of a pushback if it looks as if the Russian interference in this election continues until election time. There would certainly be more pushback in trying to regulate and diminish, Russia's activities in the United States, which they consider to be malign. How they would do that, I don't know. So I would be skeptical that you'll have a reset in the sense of there must be a better way to improve ties with Russia. This is what we're going to do. But I think what you might have is a normalization of relations, meaning going back to some of the traditional ways of interaction. But the real restriction on this too is the rafts of sanctions that the US Senate has passed during the Trump administration. The Congress, of course, has also pursued a very tough policy. There's more legislation on the books that may be passed even before the election if Russian election interference is seen to continue. And so any president, because the Congress has taken away the executive authority of the president to impose and lift sanctions, it would be difficult to do much kind of on the economic front unless all of these things are reviewed and there's a consensus that you have to walk them back. So that's by way of saying things might improve a bit, but I think to expect a wholesale improvement of relations, I think would be unrealistic.
Well, thank you very much for what has been a fascinating discussion of Russia. I apologize for getting off to a rough start there, but I think we had a power surge that shut down my computer briefly. I think at this point, I'll turn it over to Xiaoyin and let her wrap up this session. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for both of you. I was so drawn into this conversation and for the great questions and thoughts from our audience. Dr. Ziegler and Dr. Stent, thank you for the wonderful questions and the moderated, really nice flow of all of the major topics around Russia and US. And I know there's going to be a lot of more questions that we just are not going to be able to get to, but I suspect that many of these questions may be answered in Dr. Stent's book, Putin's World, Russia Against the West and with the Rest. So please, if you are as fascinated with this conversation as I have been, get a copy for yourself. I think there's going to be a lot of really much more in-depth information in that book. So thank you both. And I just want to remind everybody that we have another speaker program coming up on the 30th, September 30th, at the same time, 5:30 p.m. For that program, we are going to be featuring David Rundell on his book, Vision or Mirage, Saudi Arabia at the Crossroads. And we're going to include a number of these these information links in our follow-up email. But I hope everybody will bookmark our website, worldkentucky.org. and stay updated with all of the weekly programs we're offering during this time. Most of the programs are going to be free for students, so make sure you let us know if you are interested in these communications. And finally, I just want to say again, thank you for joining us this evening, taking some time out, and stay well and healthy. And we really hope to see you next time. Thank you again, Dr. Stent and Dr. Ziegler, and we'll see everybody at the next program. Good night.
Good night. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.